Hello. Hello, and welcome everyone to the monthly Blue Goat Cyber webinar. Today, we're joined by Jordan John, our Director of Regulatory Affairs and Compliance. We're going to be discussing 5 of the key FDA cybersecurity standards to be aware of when preparing for your medical device submission. How are you doing today, Jordan?
Great, great. It's a good topic and it's very timely with the finalization of the cybersecurity guidance. So quite excited for this one.
Definitely. And that's something that we'll get into. We're saving the best for last, some of the new changes with the official FDA cybersecurity guidance, and then discussing some of the complementary standards that can go along with it. All right. Well, without further ado, so we'll just run through which standards we're going to cover, and then we'll dive into the details in a little bit here. First, we're going to look at AAMI TIR57, the Principles for Medical Device Security Risk Management. This is closely tied into safety risk management for ISO 14971. They have a lot of points for intersection where we're evaluating the combination of safety and security risk, which is a natural evolution just due to the fact that these are medical devices where there is always going to be a little bit of that cross section. Next, we're looking at IEC 62304, medical device software lifecycle processes. This talks about the development flow for ensuring that we're designing safe and secure medical device software. Very similar standard is ISO IEC 81001-5-1, health software and health IT system safety, effectiveness, and security. This talks a little bit more about the controls and implementation based on the life cycle. Moving into some of the testing side of things, we'll talk about NIST Special Publication 800-115, a technical guide for information security testing and assessment that talks about the flow and process that we use during a penetration test against medical devices. And then finally, cybersecurity and medical devices, quality system consideration and content of pre-market submissions. This is the FDA guidance on how cybersecurity should be designed into a medical device and acts as the golden standard. All right, now the first thing that I want to talk about before we get into the actual standards are how we can integrate these standards. So, relevant standards should be identified early into your quality system before development takes place. And what that means is, as we're starting that design process, as we're starting the development process for the medical device, we want to figure out what standards are going to be relevant. How can we prepare for these early and often? How can we set up our QMS according to ISO 13485 and have all of our risk management procedures, any of our development SOPs, everything that we're going to need ahead of time put into place? Of course, this is going to branch outside of cybersecurity. This can handle anything from your safety risk management, your business risk management, how you're handling anything across your biocompatibility studies and your clinical validation. So this is something that should be considered across your entire medical device lifecycle. Now, cybersecurity standards can provide a very reproducible and clear process for risk management, which is very important. One thing that oftentimes can fall a little bit short when handling security or handling risk management in general is having a little bit of an ad hoc process. If we have a clear standardized procedure, that ensures that every time we're going through the assessment of a vulnerability, mitigating a risk, it's going to be done in the same way. And that means that we'll have very clear results as opposed to something that may vary based on the assessor or based on the process. We also want to look at standards that facilitate secure design and development process of medical devices that is going to reduce the time to market. I know Jordan can definitely speak to this point since he's seen a lot of the ins and outs of the submission process with a lot of our clients, but not having a clear process can definitely really cut down on sort of that streamlined flow getting into the FDA submission and massively increases the time to market. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts, Jordan, on what are some of the main points that we need to look at for that early integration of a reproducible standard into our development practice.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you're spot on there, Trevor. The integration piece isn't just a checkbox for the FDA. They really want to see that it's embedded into your SOPs, your risk processes, and not just a reference in the submission, right? So it's not just something you say you do in your submission. It's just like everything else in your quality system. It's quite integrated in your QMS. It's process based. It needs to be working. There needs to be evidence that it is working within your system. Really, it's like, in the FDA requirements, it, mentions tying your security back into your design control, right? And that's really what you're doing, similar to all your other requirements in design control. It needs to be embedded. So, really it's something that needs to be focused on, and the submission is an uh, afterthought, really, kind of, once you kind of create the system, you reference things, but it needs to be working well before you actually go into your submission.
And I think another big part of this as well is a lot of clients will submit the FDA required documentation, which are typically going to be the artifacts of all of these processes, but not the process themselves. And if you have the artifacts, it should act as evidence that you have these standards integrated. But if you aren't doing it properly, the time may come where there's an FDA audit or they're trying to collect any of your metrics. This is especially going to be important for like a PMA submission where you have these PMA annual reports. And when that time comes, if you are just preparing the documentation to have a final result as opposed to looking at the process, it's going to be very difficult to reproduce those. All right. Now, why do we want to integrate these standards specifically into FDA submissions? When we're looking at TIR 57, this is creating that framework for security risk management and tying it into safety. Like I mentioned earlier, it is based off of ISO 14971 and should be thought of as an extension of that standard. They should be distinct, separate processes, but there is a clear point of intersection. Similarly, with IAC 62304, we want to integrate that early on to describe our secure lifecycle process. So this isn't necessarily going to be about specific controls, what we're doing for a specific design choice. This is more looking at how we're integrating a secure lifecycle into our development cycle. Like Jordan was saying, the FDA wants to see that medical devices are designed with security in mind, as opposed to having security retrofitted at the end. IAC 62304 ensures that we're following that process. Next, we want to look at ISO and IEC 81001-5-1. So this is going to be a bit more of a standardized process around the secure product development framework and talks a little bit more about the actual implementation as opposed to the process flow. They're both very important to consider, and they both work in collaboration, which is why we wanted to call out both as opposed to one or the other. Next, we're moving into NIST Special Publication 800-115. Now, at Blue Goat, we're handling a lot of the penetration testing and a lot of the documentation. Oftentimes, one can get overlooked a little bit more than the other. This is very directly focused on penetration testing practices and procedures, helps talk about some of the other forms of security testing that we need to cover, fuzz testing, any static testing, dynamic testing, robustness testing. So there's a lot that goes into this outside of just a pure penetration test, which is why it's distinct from a standard network test when we're looking at medical systems. This is why we want to take a standardized approach. Finally, we're going to look at that cybersecurity for medical devices. This is the overall framework that we're handling for the FDA submission. So this is what we're going to feed into our eStar submission. This is overall just essentially the one-stop shop and the guidance book for what you should do when designing security in your medical device. All right, well, we can go ahead and get into some of the details on this. So the first thing that we'll talk about is TIR 57. This is a technical report that extends 14971 risk management concepts to cybersecurity threats. So 14971 is more on that safety side of things. This talks about a repeatable process for threat modeling, vulnerability assessment, and selection of risk controls across the device lifecycle. It needs to have a very clear and reproducible flow, starting from the beginning and moving down. We talk about in the risk assessment phase, this might have a cybersecurity impact as well as a safety impact, or it might only be one or the other. So this is also something that we're assessing during this evaluation. We're also mapping security risks to patient safety impacts, clarifying the reasonably foreseeable misuse that the FDA lens expects to see. Everything should be risk-based when we're going through the FDA submission, as opposed to saying there's a one-size-fits-all solution. This also talks about some practical vectors for attack trees, security risk matrices, and documentation examples so that we have something to start working off of when we're going through this process. All right, now we're getting into why it matters. So this is a recognized framework for cybersecurity risk management, which is requested now in 510K submissions, de novo submissions, PMA filings, and more. Outside of even just the FDA, this can be helpful when trying to get entered into a healthcare delivery organization. We're trying to handle something like Mayo Clinic, something like Johns Hopkins. They have their own cybersecurity requirements that can be fulfilled by a secure security risk management framework. This help demonstrates that security is managed within the design control system required by 21 CFR 82030, and we're giving a defensible rationale for residual risk acceptability and chosen safeguards. This is going to help reduce our review cycle by a significant amount. If we're just providing risk to the FDA and saying, we think this is acceptable, they're going to come back requesting some justification. Now, if we're cross-referencing TIR57, this is what the FDA treats as their golden standard. It's a good look to have it as part of your submission materials, in other words. All right, I see we had a question come in. How does this standard address updates to firmware or scripts for wireless interfaces in the medical device? So this standard specifically is meant to be very generalized. It's looking at what the actual process is for identifying a vulnerability or a specific flow. So if we're looking at an update process, we might consider, what does the update flow look like? If it's a wireless interface, we're assuming it's going to be an over-the-air update. What risks could be against the update infrastructure if you're hosting this in a cloud service provider, or if healthcare delivery organizations are supposed to have a centralized on-premise location for delivering out these updates? It is, again, going to be a risk-based approach. So it depends on what the actual update process is and just assessing the individual vulnerabilities. Where we'll get more into the technical testing and the execution is going to be NIST Special Publication 800-115. That's where we look at the actual penetration testing flow or security assessment flow, where we'll say we can identify that there might be X, Y, and Z risk in a wireless interface. If we're using a cloud-based server, we're going to identify other risks, and then we're feeding it into this risk assessment. So it's a little bit of a open-ended response, I guess, but in short, this is more just the process for evaluating these risks. All right. Now, I know, let's see, thoughts or concerns are when the module provider pushes a firmware update. Yeah, that's going to be, so if this is for a component that you don't control, essentially it's just going to come down to a matter of business risk, ensuring that you have an approved suppliers list, something that you're going to trust, something that they're going to provide you good content. If this is going to be your own component, then you're going to have to control that level of risk. You're going to have to evaluate the update itself for security and ensure that you aren't pushing out any bad updates, as well as that update process being secure. If you can't control it, of course, you're going to have to ensure that the provider is doing the same thing. All right. Now, I know there are a couple of different types of risk management. And Jordan, you're familiar with a pretty wide range of the FDA submission process outside of just security. And so given that there are so many different types of risk management, security risk management, safety risk management, business risk management, financial risk management, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on when we should start integrating security risk management and how it looks like in that overall flow of the FDA submission.
Absolutely. And I think, it's in a sense no different than all the other frameworks, in the sense that you need to start early on. You need to implement the risk analysis and risk assessment process right at the start of your design process. So again, it's not an afterthought. It's not something you come to at the end when you're, about to submit to FDA and try to figure out your risks and risk assessment. So TIR57, as Trevor has been mentioning, it ties back to ISO 14971. So we're all used to ISO 14971, the benchmark risk management standard for medical devices. But what's different is the cybersecurity aspects, really, right? But the methodology, more or less, although there are some differences, it's similar, right? So we're focusing on risk management, making sure we mitigate these cybersecurity risks as early as possible to avoid that costly downstream effect of waiting till the end. So ultimately, really kind of, it needs to be right at the beginning. You don't want to wait till the end or the middle of the project. It would be too late. So, start as early as possible, align it with your existing risk management process, and make sure everything works together and is harmonized.
Definitely. Yeah, we want to make sure this is an early process, since risk can show up in a product or in a process right at the beginning. We don't want to have to deal with it ad hoc and then move into a standardized process later. All right. Next, we're going to go into IEC 62304. So this is going to be a standard where we're talking about that secure software development lifecycle for medical device software. This is also where we get into some of the distinctions between class ABC or class 1, 2, 3 in the FDA terminology by that level of harm, and then what activities we need to prepare specifically for different classes of device. This all goes back to that risk-based approach. If we have a class C or a class 3 device, it's assumed that there's going to be a significant level of risk. This could be maybe an implantable, a high-risk diagnostic machine treating some critical illness, or something where if there's a problem that goes wrong, it could potentially lead to significant harm or even the death of the patient. Naturally, we're going to want to take extra close attention when we're handling a product like this. Now, 62304 looks at development planning, architecture, and coding, verification, validation, release, maintenance, configuration, and problem resolution. It's meant to be a one-stop shop for handling that secure development lifecycle process and going through start to finish from when we have this conceptual idea of what does the product need to do all the way down to we've implemented it, we know that it's secure, we verified it, and we've released it. How do we resolve any problems that come up in that post-market phase? So it's meant to be that total product covering across the entire life cycle. It's an easy way to integrate software risk management and traceability to hazards, including any security-related risks. Now, what we're looking at here is this traceability is especially important outside of just saying we've identified a risk, we know what it is. We need to map it back to how did the risk get discovered? How are we verifying the risk has been remediated once we implement a control? What is that control? What functionality is affected by this? So having a clear traceability mapping all the way back to the requirement, all the way down to the end is very important. Now, why does it matter? The FDA accepts IEC 62304 to satisfy many different areas of the software documentation requirements. Now, software documentation is going to be a little bit different from cybersecurity, but it usually acts as a very good entry point and sort of a backbone of a cybersecurity submission. Now, this will go right into how we talk about our development plan, our hazard analysis, and our V&V summaries in the submission package. One requirement under cybersecurity testing is security requirement testing. This can be covered under that V&V. And so it's something that might get skipped by other parts of security testing done by a third-party assessor. It's important to have this full coverage here. This acts as evidence that security is embedded into the life cycle. It goes all the way back to this security by design as opposed to security at the end. This is what the FDA expects us to see under that 2023 guidance, which has now just been finalized. This also aligns with any level of concern criteria and software bill of material traceability that reviewers now request. The software bill of materials is a hot topic with the FDA. Everyone wants to be aware of what components are going into a device. The FDA wants to ensure that it is sufficient, it's covered in the right format, and it can be difficult to get all of that met. Now, IEC 62304 talks about a process to ensure that you're meeting FDA and NTIA compliance with that software bill of materials, and you have traceability back to the component, back to any risk, and back to the resolution. Now, I know when we're going through the process, there's usually a lot of documentation that's required from that cybersecurity lens that isn't generated in other ways. And so when we're looking for documentation, I'm interested to hear what you think is going to be valuable as an output of the software process, and then where we're going to need to look elsewhere for that cybersecurity documentation.
Yeah, no, I think, with software, it's, something that we've been working with traditionally are the SDP, the design specs, requirements, and all those things. But really what matters here is the whole life cycle and how it ties back to cybersecurity risk. So you want to make sure that this traceability to your specs, any kind of risks associated with it from a cybersecurity perspective, it ties back into your risk management process, and also it's verified and validated through your V&V process. So it's a whole life cycle, and penetration testing is one way of kind of doing that, and that's what we do here, one of many tests. But of course, it's the same kind of methodology as your general design controls, where you start at design, you assess for risks, you go into risk management, you mitigate it as far as possible. And in order to demonstrate that you have done that, you need to run V&V tests and verification and validation. So really kind of, 62304 is a general standard that's been around for a long time, and it's going through revision as well. But really kind of it ties back into how it impacts cybersecurity and how you kind of in design build in security so that it's inherent by design.
So it sounds like all of these can kind of tie together in a way. You mentioned that process where we're talking about the design, moving into the assessment, moving into the risk management. And so it seems like all of these should essentially integrate together instead of being thought of as clearly distinct processes. Since we just talked about that risk management, and so identifying these risks as we're going through this V&V should get fed directly into there is sort of what it sounds like.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So it's I guess if you've been in the medical device industry, this method is defined. It's just a different topic, really, right? That's the way to treat it. Cybersecurity is a whole new topic, a new risk category that wasn't emphasized as much in the past, but now it's obviously very, very important and a high priority for the FDA customers alike. So that's exactly it, Trevor, right? You need to kind of go through that whole process, document everything, make sure you're tracing back to your risks and specs and verifying everything and anything to do with this.
Definitely. Well, while we're talking about the whole process, we can dive right into ISO IEC 81005-1, which is talking about this secure product development framework. Now, this is going all the way back to the beginning of, again, the design phase, moving all the way through that whole product development cycle. So it shouldn't be thought of as a one-stop step. This talks about safety, privacy, security, and effectiveness in a bit of a DevSecOps style process, which is essentially deployment and development operations with a security focus there. It talks about some of the threat modeling requirements, secure design reviews, any static or dynamic analysis, and then incident response planning if there is an event with your product. This is also going to look into some of those post-market obligations for vulnerability intake, how we're handling triage, coordinated disclosure. So this takes a little bit more outside of the pure development activities, talking about what needs to be done depending on the device class, and more tries to branch it out. How are we covering security across that life cycle? What are we looking at for some of the specific design requirements? How are we handling, these more targeted tasks such as static testing, and how are we handling some of these post-market risks? So it's a bit more of a broad umbrella for security within medical software while still diving in deep into some of these specific activities. So I think that there's a very big intersection between IEC 62304 and this standard, but there's enough distinction where it's important to evaluate both when we're looking at developing the product. Now, why does it matter? This goes right into that secure product development framework that is central to the FDA guidance. This is going to be easy traceability for any FDA reviewers. I'll go back for a second where we're looking at threat modeling, secure design review, static dynamic analysis, post-market obligations. All of these are direct obligations when submitting to the FDA now under the current guidance. So adhering to IEC 81001-5-1 oftentimes is going to build in all of the infrastructure, all of the systems and processes that you'll need to adhere to FDA compliance when it comes time for submission. Now we're looking at easily traceable evidence, which is going to be great for populating these submission artifacts. This will be things such as threat models, code review records for that static and dynamic testing, penetration testing results, and how we're tracing them all back to each other. This is, again, something all of these are separately required by the FDA, as well as the traceability between them. This also shows the organizational capacity to deliver secure patches and field updates, addressing any quality system and post-market expectations. So this is something that the FDA is really, really trying to emphasize recently, is having a process to deliver patches to fielded devices. They don't want devices to just be a one and done process. While it's still acceptable, if you're going to expect to use a device multiple times over an extended life cycle, the FDA wants to see that you have a way to address risk once it's been fielded. Usually this is going to be through an update process. In worst case scenarios, this can maybe be through a recall procedure. And again, it should be through a scaling level of risk. But having an update procedure in your product is something that the FDA really does like to see. Now, this is going to be particularly valuable when the device is connected into hospital infrastructure. And the reason for that is that IEC 81001-5-1 talks about medical device systems, networks, and devices themselves. It's a little bit more of a broad casted net. So we're looking at how we can handle security within the network itself. This is something that is a little bit unique that isn't necessarily addressed in some of these other standards in the level of detail that maybe it should be, since interoperability with existing healthcare delivery organization systems is critical. Now, I know this is something that comes up all the time during FDA review, is how are we handling integration into a healthcare delivery organization? How do we prove that we have these controls? And so I know that we have some labeling documentation that we like to provide, but in addition to the actual controls themselves built into the product for having encryption, having authentication, things such as that, I'm interested in hearing what are some of the good ways that we can prepare for this interoperability, this integration into healthcare infrastructure.
Yeah, I guess it all comes down back to risk management, right? So the standard really, it's especially meant for software as a medical device and any kind of connected device teams, as you mentioned. And it's different than 62304, right? Because it's definitely focused on slightly different things, not just the whole high-level software medical device development cycle. It has many different aspects. And in terms of regulatory affairs alignment, the documentation you create is important, right, in this aspect. So it aligns really well with your FDA cybersecurity guidance in topics like coordinated vulnerability disclosure, your incident response planning, post-market management of any kind of threats, and using even things like metrics in your patch deployment, for instance. So really kind of it'll tie back into several different pieces of your FDA cybersecurity documentation, including your plans on incident management, your cyber management plan as a high level, your patch management plans, and how you really kind of treat risk and triage for different threats in your threat modeling, as Trevor, you just mentioned. So there's a few different pieces really, and it's just one piece of that puzzle, right? We talked about a few different standards here, but again, software as a medical device, any kind of connected medical devices in the hospital setting, this will be quite important for your consideration.
I think you bring up a fantastic point about those metrics. So it's a requirement with an FDA submission, any class of submission, to at least provide a plan to collect specific metrics. They want to look at the percentage of vulnerabilities that are remediated as part of a set patch cycle or a set deployment cycle. They want to see what the timeline is from vulnerability identification to remediation availability, as well as remediation availability to deployment in fielded devices. So that's what we're talking about when we're trying to collect these metrics. Following these standards provides a clear method for capturing these metrics. This talks about if you need any ticketing systems, if you need any traceability, any logging systems within your internal quality system or with your internal software tracking, you're able to easily collect that. Now, these metrics can be utilized for future submissions. They can be utilized as part of a PMA annual report. So it's very important to collect all of this information as an artifact of what you're doing with these standards. All right. Now we'll go ahead and get into NIST Special Publication 800-115. So this is going to be a little bit different and talks more exclusively about testing the product as opposed to developing the product. This is one of the several NIST handbooks where they're talking about methodologies and practices for vulnerability assessment, penetration testing, security audits, and all of the different activities that go into place there. This is going to cover a fairly wide range as far as different testing activities. We can get into network, application, and physical security testing, not all of which may necessarily be applicable to any one specific medical device. However, medical devices can be such broad categories of technology. We can have purely thin client or thick client, so that'll be like a desktop binary or a web application medical device. We can have physical devices with minimal software concerns, just something small running on a microprocessor with a single functionality. We can have these huge combination systems with a mix of both. So it's good to have a bit more of a general standard that talks about the process for doing a penetration test and an assessment, as opposed to the specific testing cases that we need to use. This is also going to go over some of the high-level testing techniques that should be covered across any sufficiently detailed penetration test. This can talk about different scanning activities, different fuzzing activities, any hypotheticals with user interaction as part of that threat modeling, code analysis through a static, dynamic, and manual perspective. It's meant to cover a very wide range of testing. This also provides some sample reporting templates and then any metrics for severity and remediation tracking, which can be great if you aren't sure exactly where to start on that security testing process. This can act as sort of a good baseline and provide some valuable information to utilize for the process. Now, why does it matter? This is a endorsed playbook that justifies the pen test scope, tools, and qualification. So this talks about what the process should look like, how we cover test planning, how we address our test cases. All of this is required by the FDA for a pre-market submission. And in addition to requiring it in this specific format, all of this testing in general is required. Penetration testing is getting pushed to be done by third party reviewers. And so that's going to be getting your testing done by a sufficiently skilled penetration testing firm outside of your organization. Now, where this can get a little bit risky is since we've talked about the test planning, the test case requirements that are enforced by the FDA, these are fairly unique as far as certain different industries, which a lot of manufacturers may be familiar with. We can talk about high trust, HIPAA, PCI compliance, don't have the exact same reporting or documentation requirements. If a penetration testing company is mostly familiar with these standards, which is where most tests are directed towards, they may not be familiar with exactly what the FDA is expecting to see. This also goes into some of those test result summaries that the FDA wants to see. The documentation burdens are very different, is essentially the bottom line from the standard. Now, this provides robust and objective evidence of device resilience and shows how it can defend itself against exploits. When we're developing all of this documentation, I mentioned the test cases as part of it. The test cases are the specific attacks that we're applying to a specific device, a specific interface, or a specific technology. Any one of these test cases is going to act as evidence of whether or not this specific technology is vulnerable to a specific exploit. As I'm sure you can imagine, there are going to be a lot of different test cases that are applied depending on what the device looks like. But for each passing test case, each test case that does not lead to a vulnerability, that proves the security of the product. Now, another important thing is the terminology aligns with what the FDA wants to see as far as ongoing vulnerability scanning in the post-market phase. Having all of these standards line up, having all of the terminology, all the wording, all of the processes line up is really important. Moving from that pre-market phase into the post-market phase, you're moving from an initial build-up, initial evaluation, lots of vulnerabilities, lots of remediation, into this maintenance and upkeep phase. It should be just a clear process and something easily reproducible. All right, does the NIST standard cover or imply testing from the network protocol side? Does it also include from the wireless radio side? So there are NIST standards that are going to cover just about everything. What we're looking at with 800.115 is essentially what that secure testing process looks like, how we're planning it out, how we're moving into the execution phase on developing these test cases, developing the test report after the fact. For the process, it's going to be very similar if we're handling wireless radio. So this will be communications, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, RFID, things like that. Well, I guess RFID is going to be wireless magnetic, but the point still stands. The process should be reproduced across different technologies, while the specific test cases may vary. So what it looks like from our perspective, since oftentimes with medical devices, we're more looking on this Internet of Things, on this wireless side, as opposed to the network testing side. We will identify whatever technologies are in place and then stem from there our threat modeling activities to say, what do we think can go wrong? We'll come up with this comprehensive threat model, a list of everything that we think can go wrong, develop test cases from each of these threats in the threat model, and verify them from the penetration test. We have traceability through the full process. We have all the documentation for the process. This procedure is going to be relatively the same regardless of what technology you're working on, which is where 800.115 comes in. As far as a standard that talks a little bit more about the implementation and flow, that's going to be typically NIST 853. And it's a little bit more on the network testing side of things, but that gets more into technical details. I'm not sure if that fully answered your question, but yeah, essentially 800.115 is on the process side of things. All right. Now, I know that outside of just the penetration testing artifacts, Jordan, there's a lot that goes in from the penetration testing into some of the other documentation. And so it goes back to that point that we keep making of everything all blends together in one way or another. But how do you think the outcome of penetration testing affects the rest of the overall cybersecurity submission materials?
Yeah, so I guess, going back even a few years, the first buzzword that came out of cybersecurity was penetration testing. So before anyone knew anything about the guidance or what to do, the first thing everyone resorted to was penetration testing, right? And I think to an extent that still remains the gold standard, right? As an overall test, although there's some specific tests you need to run in addition, and that really feeds into as a key source of your cybersecurity risk in your risk management process. So it goes back as a risk item, and you need to kind of demonstrate, what those risks are if you haven't identified them yet, right? It should have been something that was captured in your threat modeling early on. But if it wasn't, and it was something that was detected during your penetration testing, that means the testing's working, right? For one, and that you need to kind of add it back in your risk management process as a risk item or a risk ID, right? A risk analysis item that you need to kind of figure out. So depending on the severity and the level of risk that comes out of these findings in penetration testing, most of the time, the recommendation is obviously to remediate. In some cases, you can justify, if it's non-applicable or what it, how it might not interact to the same level of risk that was perceived during the testing. But ultimately, this is a direct source into your risk management process. You need to mitigate it, and then you need to go back to retesting, or after remediation you go into retesting, do a penetration test again to ensure that you've actually effectively eliminated or mitigated to a lowest level possible in terms of cybersecurity risk and threat.
And I think that last phase is definitely something that we've seen come up from the FDA before in the past, and we've handled this situation before where there'll be a certain timeline that the manufacturer needs to adhere to for their submission. And so they'll go to the FDA and they say, hey, we had this initial penetration test done. Here's our plan for remediation. We'll get to it before the submission is finalized, before the device is out on the market. And they may expect that to be sufficient evidence for the FDA to approve them. And the FDA, they want to work with you. They want to be understanding. So oftentimes what they'll do is they'll come back and they say, great, well, thanks for providing that plan. Let us know when you have the evidence that you've executed it, and we'll fast track this process. And so they're still going to want to see this remediation test come through, regardless of how you try to explain around it. So I think it's something that is important to keep in mind when you're trying to plan out the timeframes for this. All right. And now we're getting into likely the most important document for this entire topic, and that's going to be the FDA's pre-market guidance for cybersecurity and quality considerations in medical devices. This is the definitive roadmap for embedding cybersecurity with different controls in pre-market filings. This talks about that whole product development framework and this total product life cycle. We're looking at a risk-based approach to handling risk management. So scaling levels of risk depending on scaling levels of device complexity and involvement, talking about generating that SBOM, maintaining that SBOM, what we're doing as far as our testing procedures. And the FDA guidance also talks about all of the accompanying standards that are important for a specific procedure or a specific process. This is where we see references to NIST 800-115. This is where we see references to IEC 62304. So the FDA guidance is talking about all of these other standards and how they can interact in different ways to ensure that we have complete coverage about security for the device. Now, the FDA guidance talks about specific artifacts that need to be prepared when we're moving into that eSTAR submission. We're looking at the threat model, risk management report, software bill of materials, the pen test report, labeling, post-market management plans, our risk assessment. There's a lot that goes into an eSTAR submission, and the pre-market guidance is going to act as essentially the checklist to get through it all. This also talks about some of the expectations for patching processes, coordinated disclosure, any personal responsibilities as far as that post-market cycle. So who's involved with what are they doing when we're moving into that post-market phase? I know I mentioned before the FDA is really having this push to make sure that devices can be updated in the field so that we don't have any potentially vulnerable devices remaining in the field. And so this FDA guidance really talks about some of the practices that we should have in place for that process. Now, why it matters. So compliance is now presumed for clearance or approval as of October 1st in 2023. One thing that I will note here is actually as of last Friday, the FDA guidance was updated and finalized. But once we were in, I believe it was September 27th was when we had the previous finalization that then got completed within October. What the FDA was looking at then, that's when they're enforcing these cybersecurity requirements. So before, cybersecurity requirements were very thin. Now they're trying to refine the process. And so the latest major update was actually this Friday, which we'll talk about in a little bit here what that update means. But the FDA guidance is going to provide essentially the templates for what documents are required, what should be included in each of those documents, and then what level of detail is expected as reviewers are going through this evaluation process. Since again, it all comes back to that risk based approach, it's going to depend on your class of device, what type of submission, things like that. Now, this is encouraging device manufacturers to cite conformity to all of these standards that we talked about. Now, of course, this isn't a comprehensive list of any of the standards that can apply to a medical device, but looking at some of these standards that we've mentioned, TIR57, 62304, 81001, 800-115, these are all great things to reference as part of your submission materials. Now, this also talks about cybersecurity activities in alignment with quality regulations. And then this is going to move compliance with the standard is going to reduce the risk of getting a delay as part of any additional information letters, the risk of having a non-substantially equivalent letter from the FDA. So ensuring that you have everything lined up with the FDA guidance is just going to be the best way to get that FDA approval, which it seems like it would be, a little bit of an obvious statement to go through that, but the guidance is very complex. It talks about a lot of these different standards, and it talks about how compliance with other standards is going to meet some of these different requirements. So really understanding what it's talking about is super important. Now, we can jump into some of the most recent changes, which has been the buzz on everyone's mind lately. So I know that previously, in a complaint that just about everyone's had with this FDA approval process, is clarity around some of these items. And so the FDA recently just pushed out Section 7 of this guidance document talking about quality considerations for cybersecurity and medical devices. And what Section 7 is doing is they're clearing up the definitions on what is a cyber device. What are some examples of a cyber device? When is this documentation going to be required? When should a resubmission be required? How are we handling any of the post-market requirements? What specifically needs to be done? And so I'd be curious to hear your thoughts if you think there will be any shifts in overall processes for handling an FDA submission, or if you think it's just going to be a little bit more clarity on a previously enforced process.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Trevor. And just looking at the finalized guidance document, at a high level, it looks more or less the same, right? Because we've been dealing with these submissions almost daily, submitting quite a few submissions to the FDA. We get feedback all the time. We improve our processes internally. But to someone who has no system in place, right, it's important to really focus on this new guidance, right? And take a look at it, right? If you don't have that legacy information, right, in terms of FDA feedback on what to improve, what to focus on, it does seem like a shift, although it is not quite, right? So some of the terminology has changed from recommendations to some things that are mandatory, which at Blue Goat Cyber, we already consider mandatory just because we know it's important from a risk assessment, risk management perspective. So the methodology, the requirements at a high level has not changed so much. As you mentioned, it clarifies requirements, right, in terms of what's required, what's expected. And some of that information was not captured in the, a now dated draft guidance document, just because it was a draft guidance, it was a work in progress. Now, this finalized guidance document corrects some of those confusing areas, right? It clarifies what exactly is required, what's mandatory, and so on. So I'd say, definitely read through this new finalized guidance document. It is the new standard that needs to be followed, of course. It is important 100%, but it should not cause a stir in the industry. I don't think it's going to be game changing, right? As long as you had processes in place, you've been thinking about cybersecurity, nothing has been reinvented. It's just, a newer and better version of what was out there, in my opinion.
I definitely agree. And I think you bring up a great point about if a manufacturer is going through their first submission, I think this is going to be very helpful for them. This provides a lot more clarity and removes some of the ambiguity that was previously present in the guidance documentation. I know oftentimes a lot of manufacturers would even have a hard time defining, is our device actually a cyber device? And so this clears up a lot of that. All right. Now, I want to do just a quick overview of some of the key takeaways from what we've discussed. So, start with secure by design frameworks instead of trying to fit security on at the end. This is going to reduce your time to market, reduce the risk of costly mistakes, and ensure that you're meeting compliance with the FDA by having that security by design in place. Treat every cybersecurity threat as a potential safety hazard. This is why TIR57 is thought of as an extension of ISO 14971. They should have a direct correlation, and if we're identifying there may be an intersection between the two, we should feed one into the other. We should show early proof that we're following any best practices to shorten review cycles. Referencing these standards, showing direct artifacts as a result of following these standards is a great way to reduce the overall review time within the FDA. We want to identify the risk level upfront so that testing depth and any assessments match the danger. Now, identifying what class of a device, what risk of a device is for your product can be a little bit difficult. And this is where we often recommend doing an informational meeting or going through the Q-Sub process with the FDA, which can let you go through a little bit more of an interactive back and forth review for these early phases. The FDA can help you classify your level of risk. They can help you with your device classification, and that lets you know what level of effort and what level of complexity needs to go into this process. We want to see threat models that link attack paths all the way down to the controls that stop them. This is part of the traceability for a risk management report that the FDA wants to see. We have to identify the hypotheticals, verify whether or not they can be executed, and then move all the way down to how we fix them if they can be executed. We want to see how methodical penetration tests are done and see very clear, transparent results. A penetration test should be thought of as looking under the hood, really getting into the device and trying to figure out everything that can go wrong. It's going to be as comprehensive as possible and ensure that we're clearing up any risks before the device enters the post-market phase. Now, on that topic, we can't fix everything. It's impossible to have perfect security in a product. And so when we're moving into this post-market phase, we want to see how we're identifying vulnerabilities, fixing them, and remediating, pushing out these remediations while the device is fielded. It's very important to have a clear process for this, and ideally we're able to execute these updates remotely. Now, we want to see all of this integrated into existing quality system workflows. It should be a start to finish security process, and we want to see how we're addressing security throughout that entire total product lifecycle. All right. I want to take a moment to see if we have any questions coming in from the audience here. Perfect. And while we wait to see if any of those come in, I want to check in and see if you have any good closing thoughts or if there are any specific points you want to make sure that everyone takes home from this, Jordan.
Yeah, I think, these points you've been bringing up, Trevor, is quite important, right? Depending on what function you're working in, right? Your focus might be a little different, right? But generally, as we've been discussing, cybersecurity and compliance is not just, good engineering practice, right? That's one side of it. Oftentimes, in the past, it's been considered best practices, safe practices, whatever you want to call it, right? But right now, from a business perspective, right, your business partners, marketing teams, sales teams, right, they're really requiring these pieces to be in place, right, even from a customer perspective. So the FDA has mandated it, but you go through tenders, contracts, RFPs, your customers are asking for all these things, or at least most of it at this point in time in most cases, right? So it is definitely important from a customer perspective as well. And when you do comply to these FDA requirements, it becomes, kind of a double win, right? From a market potential perspective and a compliance perspective. And it's really not just about, getting through your FDA clearance or your FDA approval process. It's about building that system that's sustainable, that's long term, that will work, right? From time to time, it gets improved. It might not be perfect, just like any other system. You build your quality system, you improve it over time. It needs to mature as you evolve and go through your product life cycle, your company life cycle, and so on. So really, it does tie back directly to patient safety in many cases. And it's important to kind of consider it a mandatory requirement that has a benefit to the safety of your users, patients, and so on, right? So it's a whole connected world, right? If you want to call it, and everything has an impact on one another. So ultimately, I think it's something that should be focused on from your regulatory perspective, but also your business and marketing side as well, right? So definitely tied directly to the success of your business to avoid, a long list of AIs or additional information requests from the FDA, potential deficiencies that lead to, remediations that take a long time to fix and retest and so on. So really, if you do have questions, the pre-sub process, as Trevor mentioned, is a good process. It takes a long time. And also, if you've been through pre-subs, the FDA does not always have answers for you. They often quote that they're not consulting, right? That's not what they offer to you. But if you do have any of those technical questions or you're just not sure where to start, right? A good place to start would be at Blue Goat Cyber and to reach out and clear up and clarify some of your questions. So you get quick answers, the correct answers, and you're able to kind of move on with your R&D plans and product pipeline without further delay, right? So that's what we're here for, really. We deal with this day to day, right? So if you have any other questions, we're happy to answer, right, at any point in time. So I'd highly encourage you reach out to experts like ourselves and chat about your concerns, your plans early on, as Trevor has been mentioning, so that it's inherent by design, right? Your security needs to be inherent by design, not something that you build on for a submission and patch on after the fact.
100%. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for attending, everyone. And thank you so much for joining this webinar, Jordan. It's always good to have a new face attending one of these webinars. So awesome. Well, thank you all so much for attending, and we hope to see you on the next one.